Welcome to our session today. It will review information related to support for response to discipline disproportionality. I am Dayla Brown, PBIS specialist, and joining me are Denise Forehand, PBIS division coach, as well as Elizabeth Bryant, coordinator of parent stakeholder services in the Department of School Leadership. So we're excited to have everyone here today. See a few more coming into the space here. As you enter, please share your name and your role and what you hope to gain from this session. We're excited to be with everyone. We want to let you know that this session will be recorded and will be included within the library of resources for this conference. Though it will be recorded, only active speakers are included in the recording, so we want to make sure you're aware of that. And so responses shared in our Jamboard activities today or in our breakout room at the end or in the chat area will not be recorded. This session, as indicated during your registration, supports the first conference learning intention that you see here listed. However, you'll also see that what we'll discuss today also reinforces our goal to support educational excellence as well as student well-being. And so we want to make you aware of that as we move forward into our session today. So I want to review our learning intentions for today in this session. And as we review these learning intentions, keep in mind which one you feel may be more critical in your work right now. We're going to be sharing a poll after we review them so that you can share your response. And so first, we're going to be identifying data needed to accurately determine some of those rates of discipline disproportionality. We'll also talk about how we analyze that data to identify some critical areas of need or improvement. And then we will spend some time talking quite a bit about determining what those appropriate actions might be that are going to impact discipline disproportionality. And then, of course, lastly, we'll talk about how we identify ways to monitor the effects of intervention that we put in place to impact disproportionality. And so, as I mentioned, we want to share a poll. And so in this poll, we want to ask you to share with us which one of these learning intentions you feel is most critical in your work right now. So we're going to give you a minute to respond in this poll. Just select one that you feel like is most critical. We know that all of them are critical to our work. Just share with us which one do you feel for you is most critical in your work right now. We'll give you all a minute to share your choice here, and I will share the results when we're all done. All right, so let's see where we all are as a group. I'll share these results. So this is where we are. We've got some similar results from our various sessions, but we see a lot of us are in the third area, that third learning intention, just wanting to know what are those actions that we put in place to impact disproportionality. So we will be spending quite a bit on that area. Looks like a lot of you are also interested in the last one as well. So I'm very interested in finding out where we are and where some of our priorities are. We want to make sure we gauge that before we begin. We also will be referencing several sources today in our session. And so to minimize distraction and keep the pace and flow within this session, we'll provide you with all of these links and resources in a document at the end of this session. So that'll be shared at the end, so no worries, you will get all of that. We will also right now put a copy of our presentation slides in the chat. They're also uploaded, of course, to Sched. And they are also in our resource document, but we know we often are asked to have a copy of the presentation slides. So they are shared with you in the chat as well. We always do begin as we talk about any topic within PBIS. We always begin with that shared understanding of what PBIS is in Virginia Beach. And so we know we're anchored to goal 2 within our strategic framework. PBIS does focus on the goal of student well-being. And so note also the PBIS definition on the right. And so many of us are familiar with this. Today, we'll take a look at each of these pieces as we plan for our return to school toward that goal of course, developing effective learning environments for all students. And so we want to ask, how can we re-envision data to inform future support? We want to reflect on how our framework can organize social, emotional, behavioral support for all students. In addition, of course, we know that every goal within the strategic framework has an embedded equity emphasis, right? And so within goal 2, we know that we are focused on engaging in culturally responsive practices division-wide, as well as identifying and addressing those inequities in our discipline practices, right? And specifically through PBIS, Virginia Beach City Public Schools has had the desire to move toward equitable discipline as well as fostering positive school climate, right? And so in this session today, we'll focus in on that first bullet you see there, continuing to move toward that goal of equitable discipline. And so as we continue to move into where we are here today in Virginia Beach, our strategic action agenda for the 21-22 school year specifically identifies educational equity as one of our three key goals, and many of us are aware of this. Within educational equity, we are focused on professional learning, which includes culturally responsive practices. And in this session, we'll specifically outline how these practices are integrated within the PBIS framework. And as we focus on educational equity, we also want to start with some shared language. We know how important shared language is. And so take a moment to read this definition of educational equity shared in our strategic action agenda. As you read this definition, share in the chat a word or phrase that is most meaningful to you at this time. And so we'll invite you to share that in the chat. I see a lot of words coming in already. A lot about access and inclusivity, barrier-free. Yeah, that's been coming up quite a bit in quite a few of our sessions. It's always important to figure out where we are, specifically where we are in our own personal context, but where we are right now in Virginia Beach. And so as we look at what our own strategic action agenda is, it's very important to reflect on that for our own work, think about what resonates with us, and how that moves us forward in our work in the upcoming year. Thank you for your responses. Before we begin to outline the specific steps involved in responding to discipline disproportionality, we want to offer some background, right? And so the problem of discipline disproportionality is both long-standing and widespread, as we know. And so what exactly are we talking about when we refer to discipline disproportionality? So shared in a VDOE presentation, April of 2021, discipline disproportionality was defined as a group's representation in a particular disciplinary category that exceeds the amount expected for that group, whether on a school or a division level. So we want to make sure we start with that shared definition and that understanding of what we are speaking about today. And so as we look at that context, our historical context, as well as across the state, current trends show both nationwide and in Virginia, as is shown on this slide, that when it comes to school discipline, African American students have been suspended 2 to 3 times more frequently than other students. And so take a moment to note the data on this slide that comes from the VDOE school quality profiles. You'll notice that each graph represents short-term as well as long-term suspensions. On the left, you'll notice the percent of total student population represented for various groups, as well as their percent of those suspensions as well. So take note of what you see, what stands out to you. Historically, students with disabilities, as well as African American students, have been suspended more often and for more subjective and less serious types of behaviors than their non-disabled and white peers have. As early as 1975, in one of the earliest investigations of school disciplinary policies and practices, the Children's Defense Fund revealed exactly the same statistic back in 1975, that suspension rates for African American students were between 2 and 3 times higher than those for white students. And so we all know that remaining cognizant of disproportionality is important as we work to ensure that each student in Virginia Beach City Public Schools has the opportunity to achieve success. And so recently shared in the quarterly research bulletin, we'll share this in the document at the end of this session as well, specifically in Virginia, 16 of 132 school divisions, to include Virginia Beach, reported a rate of suspension for Black students 3 times higher than the rate of suspensions for non-Black students. And so the information we've just shared offers some of the why on that kind of state level context that informs what we are sharing today. However, we'd also like to provide some context here in Virginia Beach City Public Schools in this area of disproportionality. This work we know is not new to us here. However, many of you might not know how and when PBIS came to Virginia Beach. And so in January of 2016, as you see here reflected on this slide, the School Discipline Task Force, in response to data being reviewed at that time, established 3 goals. You'll see them here at the top right. They guided several key decisions, and one of them focused on discipline disproportionality, as you see. And as a result, many recommendations were made, as you see reflected here at the bottom. And one of those recommendations, of course, included division-wide implementation of PBIS. And so then in September of 2019, as we bring it closer to Virginia Beach, the division implementation team, that's a team which oversees PBIS implementation on a division level, they began a division-wide review of discipline data for the 2019-2020 school year, reflected in the school data portfolio. And now, of course, we know that that year was cut short, right, a bit. And so we know that the last 4 months of data we had available in there were represented for September through December of 2019. And so when this team reviewed the data for those 4 months, we looked at the top problem behaviors that were reported during that specific time. And disruption was most often reflected within the top 3 problem behaviors for all levels across the division. In addition, we noticed that it was revealed in discipline report graphs during the same time period that disproportion for African American students was also evident. And so while African American students made up 23% of the total student population in Virginia Beach City Public Schools, they received an average 44% of total referrals and an average 47% of total suspensions. And so this disproportion was not revealed, we noticed, in these same graphs for the 2 other groups represented in those specific graphs for that time period, both Hispanic as well as Caucasian students. And so this data is especially relevant to us, to PBIS, as the decision to formally implement PBIS, as I previously shared, in 2016 was a direct recommendation by the School Discipline Task Force in response to discipline disproportionality. And so that's a lot of data I just shared. And so as we review data, it's critical that we pause for a moment and reflect on the perspectives of one of our most critical stakeholder groups, our students, of course. And so as adults, we know we have certain opinions as we reflect on disproportionality data. But what are the perspectives of our students, and particularly our Black students who are implied in this data? And so through the leadership of the Office of Family and Community Engagement, we've been able to gather student feedback related to several key areas, and one of which is their initial thoughts and feelings about the discipline disproportionality data we have just shared with you today. And so through the facilitation of one of the family and community engagement representatives, an African American female focus group was asked the questions that you see listed here on this slide. What are your thoughts about this data, and how do you feel about it? And so these responses represent one perspective on discipline disproportionality, and here were their responses. Take a moment to read these responses, and as you read them, consider whether they may resonate with thoughts or feelings you may have also had, or whether they may come as a surprise to you, or whether they may differ from your initial responses to the data. It's important for us as we reflect on some of this data and begin to think about what our decisions and action steps are. It's important for us to prioritize voices across all groups, specifically our students. And so this can be a really helpful activity to engage in even on a school level. We've done it on a division level. However, it would be critical, even for schools, to think, what are the perspectives of your students? What are your perspectives of your families as you begin to think about what next steps might be? And so thus far, we've shared quite a bit of background information about disproportionality. And we want to acknowledge that many of you have already been engaged in addressing this data in your own work, or you may have observed work being done in this area in your role here in Virginia Beach at some point. And so we want to provide a Jamboard link in the chat right now. And what we'll ask you to do is take 2 minutes to jot down your responses to either of the choice questions you see here on this slide. Either what successes have you observed related to this data on a school level, or how has disproportionality been discussed at your school, or if you're a central office staff member, in your role in central office. And so in the Jamboard, you'll notice that those choice questions are provided on the first slide as well as the second slide. And so feel free to respond to either one of those choice questions, or if you choose both of them. And just share what your responses might be to either one of those questions, and notice the responses of your peers as well. All right. And so as we continue to keep adding to the Jamboard and reflecting, I want to share a little bit more about some of this work on a division level that we've been engaging in around some of the data I have just shared. And so in response to that data that I shared earlier around disruption and disproportionality that division implementation team reviewed, that team took time then to consider what a possible outcome goal might be that we would like to share with you all today. And this outcome goal is guiding our work and our support for schools across the division. And so it's quite loaded, this outcome goal. And so to better understand it, we have broken it down into three parts to better relay it to everyone across the division. And so we've developed two versions of that outcome goal. One with which corresponds to schools which have reached 80% fidelity of PBIS implementation, and then a goal for those schools that have not. And so, as many of you know, PBIS coaches work with school PBIS teams to measure fidelity, with the target goal being 80% fidelity of PBIS implementation. And so we'll dive into this first outcome goal. So based on the data we reviewed as a team, this first version of the outcome goal states that 80% of our schools that have maintained that fidelity for at least 1 year and receiving central office support, including all of those offices you see here around culturally responsive PBIS implementation for at least a year, will then decrease their referral and suspension risk ratios for African American students by 0.67 or will decrease to or maintain a risk ratio within a 0.25 range of 1. Now, that's a whole load of words I just shared there. So let me break down a little bit. You may be asking, what is a risk ratio and where are all those numbers coming from? And so here, risk ratios measure the risk of referrals or suspensions occurring for a group here for African American students when compared to the risk of referrals or suspensions occurring for our other racial or ethnic groups. So the goal is a risk ratio of 1. And so a risk ratio of 1 means there's no difference between groups in terms of their risk of being referred or suspended. And so for those schools with significantly higher risk ratios, we arrived at that decrease you see here of 0.67. And that was based on research we gathered that points to the positive impact on these risk ratios when PBIS is implemented within the context of culturally responsive practices. All right, and so explained a little bit more about the outcome goal. The second version of this outcome goal, as mentioned, refers to the group of schools that have not yet reached 80% fidelity of PBIS implementation. And so many of our high schools fall into this category. Some of you here with us in this session. And so most of them began implementation in the 1920 school year. And so this target also acknowledges the fact that high schools take an average of 3 years to implement PBIS successfully. And so this outcome goal states that schools that have not yet reached that 80% fidelity will first reduce their fidelity gap annually, about 33%, so working on that 3-year track. And with that same central office support for that 1 year, will demonstrate a decreasing trend in referral and suspension risk ratios, right? So similar to the first one, except just moving toward that trend. And so similar to what was explained in that previous version of the outcome goal, this goal is still movement toward that risk ratio of 1, even for schools that have not yet reached 80% fidelity. And so then what now? So what did we do? During the spring of 2021, we held some teacher focus groups and we pulled together countless teachers across all levels to give us some feedback on some various areas related to PBIS. And so one of those areas was related to the question you see here: how has disproportionality been discussed at your school? And so when we asked them, this is what we received from many of those teachers across all of those teacher focus groups across all levels. So I'll give you a minute to read these responses that these teachers offered us. As you read some of these responses, consider how these teacher responses might be similar or different than what was shared as a group on the previous Jamboard activity we just engaged in. Some of them are a bit similar, some of them look a little different. This is a great activity to participate in, to consider where your teachers are, where have you been as a school, how has this conversation been happening on a school level. It's very important to consider where we are as we continue to move forward. And this was an important piece to really kind of gauge where we are and what are our teachers' perspectives related to this particular conversation around discipline disproportionality. And so here we are today, right? So previous research highlights that educators need specific guidance for using discipline data to assess and measure this disproportionality, as well in a method that's both effective and efficient. We know how critical this can be, especially as leaders. And so in this session, we're going to explore the guide for response to discipline disproportionality that's been provided to all school PBIS teams and administrators. And you'll see it linked here in the chat. This is the heart of what we're going over today. And this is critical for our work as we consider our next steps. And so I want to give you some background around this guide. It's been quite a project in developing this across many offices. And so along with PBIS teams, DOSL, Office of Student Leadership, Office of Planning, Innovation, and Accountability, we will be involved in the direct support of this guide. So it's not just our PBIS teams that will be supporting it. This is integrated across the division. And so this document has also been shared, you might know already, through Office of Student Leadership sessions during those SBAR sessions this summer, and will continue to be shared through our PBIS professional learning this fall. Also, what's really important to note about this guide that you're looking at is that we have really included stakeholder feedback as we've developed this guide. So we do see it as a living document, right? So as we continue to use this guide to inform our next steps, we want to make sure it's responsive to all of our stakeholder groups, both our school staff, our school leaders, but also our students, our families, and other staff across the division. And so we've already gotten feedback from teachers, school leaders, DOSL, students, families, central office staff, just to develop this guide that you see here. And we're open to additional feedback as we continue to move forward. And so within the guide, you'll see we've just provided, you'll notice it's divided into 4 steps. Each of these 4 steps describe the actions school PBIS teams may engage in when reviewing disproportionate discipline data. We also want to mention that the information within this guide comes from the research brief shared by PBIS.org, which we will also provide to you as well at the close of this session. And so the steps outlined here reflect how we'll review the guide with you today. It's quite a bit in it, so we want to walk through each step. So within each step, not only will we tell you what each step entails, but we're also going to share an example of what this process might look like for a particular middle school. And you'll see that that sample is also provided in the guide we shared with you. So we're going to dive in. Okay, so let's begin looking at step 1. What is step 1? This is that problem identification step. Many of you who've been involved in PBIS, this will feel familiar to you as it mirrors our data-informed decision-making process. And so this first step involves asking, is there even a problem? Okay, so this involves asking, what do we notice when we're looking at the data? Is there any discipline data which is reflecting disproportionality for specific groups? If so, what are our risk ratios reflecting, right? And so this involves that understanding of what risk ratios are and knowing that we are moving toward that goal of a 1, right? But as we look at those risk ratios and as we might discover possibly discipline disproportionality, we want to ask what data or information may be missing from this picture, right? And so we often skip this step. We often just dive right into the data and begin action planning. But we really need to stop and think, what additional information do we need to gather to complete this data picture? So it might involve looking at classroom managed data, right? We might find we're only looking at office referrals, and that might not complete the picture related to behavior in our building. It might also mean that we need to include more voices in the conversation, right? And so if we begin to notice that we need more classroom managed data or that classroom level data, and that's our next step, then we need to think about when would we document that? And how would that be documented if we want to use that to complete our data picture? And so we recognize that this step requires more detailed information for you all regarding how you might identify and locate this data on a school level. So we want to share all principals have access to ratio data regarding discipline referrals for prior years through your school data portfolio. And it looks very much like this. So this is the principal view that you will see. We've gathered this information from the Office of Planning, Innovation, and Accountability, and they've provided this information for you today. And so to access this data, you'll need to access the intranet page and navigate to the Secure Documents folder, and then follow the pathway at the top of this slide. Many administrators, this will seem familiar to you. As noted on the slide, the data is available for 2018, 2019, and prior years only. Of course, this is due to the pandemic, right? And so the numbers for the 2020 and 2021 school year are going to be analyzed this summer by the Office of Planning, Innovation, and Accountability, and they will determine if they will be able to provide that report for this past year. And so you will hear that in the upcoming weeks and months. If you have questions, of course, because we often do get a lot of questions about how to access this or where else to access these reports, you can contact Robert Weigel in the Office of Planning, Innovation, and Accountability directly, and he can walk you through how to access this data. We also want to share, of course, you may also access division and school level data on the School Quality Profiles website. It would enable you to calculate risk ratios if you choose to do that on your own. And the link will be provided to you on the session links document at the end of this session as well. I want to make sure you have that. Now, this is a lot about past data, right? And where you can see some of your previous data, but you might be wondering where you will be able to access future data, right? We're working toward developing a report that would make specifically risk ratio data for subgroups available to all admin in the fall. And so as we work to do that and streamline that for you all, we'll develop a video tutorial that will be shared through Docile, which will explain how to access this report. So it will be made available to administrators in the fall as we move forward. And so as we're still living in this first step here, problem identification, we did talk about that classroom managed behavioral data. If a school does identify that they want to think about how to collect classroom managed data, they might use a behavior observation form to collect data in order to gain a more accurate picture of what behaviors staff are responding to on a daily basis. And so here's an example of one behavior observation form that has been used by many schools to gather classroom level data, right? And so these are considered to be those low level behaviors that a teacher can be expected to manage within the classroom and not involving writing an office discipline referral as a consequence, right? So some of that's managed in the classroom. On the right, you'll see an example of a few criteria one elementary school used to determine when this data will be collected. It's very important for schools to determine when, if they choose to complete classroom level data and to collect this level data, to determine this as a school. How would this be collected and when would this be collected? And this is just one example that was used by one school. This process has also been used in various ways on the secondary level as well. And so here's an example of a Google form used by middle school grade level teams to gather information related to classroom managed behavior. And what they did is they used this Google form as grade level teams met each month. They completed this form, and the PBIS team reviewed this data on a monthly basis to be able to kind of gauge what was happening within classrooms on a monthly basis by grade level teams. So this process could be adapted for high school PLCs, and you can see your PBIS coach for more support specifically in this area of collecting classroom managed behavior data. And so what might this look like for a specific middle school? Okay, so we'll look at what one middle school might do in relation to problem identification. And so what did they do? After reviewing their discipline data report, the PBIS team discovered that compared to Caucasian students, African-American students had a risk ratio of 3.2, and Hispanic and Asian students both had risk ratios of 1.1. And so they determined that these metrics indicated some significant disproportionality for African-American students because that risk ratio was above their federal disparate impact criterion of 1.25. So it was too far from that one we spoke about earlier, right? And so the team, what did they do? They then decided to set a year-end goal of reducing the referral risk ratio for African-American students to below 1.25. And so what did they do next? And the team decided they wanted to use their data to examine why was this problem happening. And then as a result of that, they wanted to create an action plan to then reduce, of course, those disproportionate rates of referrals for African-American students, right? So that's a lot to set forth for a team, right? So they did this, but you might be wondering, okay, now that they had this data, what did they then do with it? Okay, so this involves our second step within this guide, which is problem analysis. We've gotten our data. We know what we're looking at. How do we analyze it to figure out what's really happening in this data now that we feel like we have a complete picture? So we ask that question, why is this happening? And so let's look at what this involves. The first piece of this involves assessing PBIS Tier 1 fidelity first before examining specific discipline referral situations. Right? We know that assessing whether PBIS is fully in place as a foundation for effective behavior support is critical, right? If we don't have some of those critical initial pieces in place, it's going to be hard to move forward an action plan, right? And this includes an assessment with a culturally responsive lens, right? And so PBIS coaches are able to provide support in this area, as this was also content shared in an essential webinar with teams last fall. And so once we assess PBIS fidelity, then we ask what variables can be changed within the system. So this involves looking closer to identify that who, that what, that where, that when, and that why reflected in our data. And this might sound familiar to many of you who are part of PBIS teams. We ask those questions to see what is really happening in that discipline data we're analyzing. And this is a critical step here. This step involves critical partnerships on a school level. And so we ask what other team or staff in our school analyze an action plan around academic data. We want to share our disproportionality data with this group as well. And so when we do that, we want to ask, do achievement or opportunity gaps exist for certain groups? Are there similarities possibly in disparities revealed in academic data and discipline data? And so at this stage, school teams begin to work together toward a common goal, right? That common goal of well-being, of belonging, of positive behavior, and of course of high academic achievement for all groups reflected in our data. And so what might this look like for that middle school, right? So here's that middle school sample, right? So we want to offer a snapshot, right? So here, the team is digging deeper into their data, as we mentioned before, to get a clearer, more specific data picture in order to identify some of their opportunities where support could be provided. And so first they developed a problem statement in order to clarify the need. I'll give you a minute to read that. And so as you read this problem statement, this will probably also look familiar to many of you that were a part of your PBIS team work in your schools or in other schools you've been in. This mirrors our process of developing problem statements as a part of our data-informed decision-making process as PBIS teams. And so this team did this as well, right? And so what else did they notice? They noticed that their overall PBIS fidelity was 80%, right? So they were at fidelity for PBIS implementation. However, what did they also notice? They noticed that within their implementation, they had lower fidelity in the areas of problem behavior definitions and classroom procedures. So they didn't just look at overall fidelity, but they looked in on some of the features within their implementation and noticed there were some low areas of implementation. And so the team then identified areas for improvement for their discipline procedures specifically. So they further clarified what some of their behaviors should be that are classroom and office managed. And they also decided to use consequences other than sending students to the office. And then what did they do? Here's this piece about partnerships. So they shared their disproportionality data with ILT to investigate some potential gaps that might be there, achievement or opportunity gaps. And then upon further analysis, the ILT, when they dug into their data, they identified that 44% of African American students and 52% of Hispanic students were meeting or exceeding standards on the state reading achievement test, but it was compared to 71% of Caucasian students, right? And so this is their analysis of that problem. So as you read this example, you may be wondering, what steps would this team now take? And so with all of this information, I'll pass this to Denise Forehand, who will take us through step 3 in this process.
Thank you, Dayla. So step 3, plan implementation, is organized into 5 parts. And the PBIS research indicates that cultural responsiveness that is grounded in the 5 components: identity, voice, supportive environment, situational appropriateness, and data for equity. It increases the likelihood that PBIS implementation will positively impact discipline dispro for subgroups. And like Dayla said, the 5 components were shared with PBIS teams through essential webinar that was provided last fall. And we'll give you a link at the end of this session. But before we continue with step 4, we'll take you through all the 5 components within step 3, which is cultural responsiveness within PBIS. And then we'll take you through examples of what a middle school team might do, just like we've done already. As we go through each one of the 5, we will provide time for you to read and describe each description and then reflect in the chat. So we'll do that for all 5 components. So you don't have to be read to today. All right, so we're going to go on to the first core component, which is identity. So take a moment to read the description of identity with CRP, culture responsive practices, and then put a word in the chat or a phrase that stands out to you that you feel like is important. Melinda, validate the values of students, cultural awareness, awareness and understanding, understanding cultural identities, yes, and our own identities so that we can have our own self-awareness. Yes, projection of personal things on other cultures, that's true. Thank you for your participation. And now we're going to show you a middle school, the example of what this middle school did. The PBIS team and the ILT plan to attend division level professional learning around implicit bias as it relates to classroom managed behaviors. The PBIS team and the ILT will then bring back that training to their building and provide professional learning to help all get a better understanding of implicit bias and focus everyone's attention to how it may play a role in the situations described in that problem statement in step 1. Okay, and the second component is voice. So again, take a minute to read the description on the slide and choose a word or phrase that stands out to you and share it in the chat. Authentic. Meaningful opportunities for everyone. Engage with families. See themselves and their histories, you're right. Okay, now again, I'm going to share with you what this middle school did in this section. They wanted to elevate student and family voice within the PBIS implementation process. In an effort to improve cultural responsiveness and consistency, the team also holds several town halls for families and meetings with students, groups to help get input and review their behavioral expectations and the matrix with students and families. So holding several town halls to get better clarity and to provide input and communication. All right, the third core component is supportive environment. Again, the same procedure. Take a minute to read the slide and highlight a word or a phrase that stands out to you and share it in the chat. Meet student needs, desired behaviors, framework to teach. Meet students' needs. Okay, thank you all for participating in that chat. All right, now we're going to go again with an example of what a team decided to do at this particular middle school. It decided to provide explicit teaching of expectations and procedures, specific direction for positive student acknowledgement, and the teaching and reinforcement of SEL skills. The team members worked with grade levels to review class expectations and procedures before lunch and provide choice brain breaks for 2 minutes upon returning from lunch. And the staff were reminded through the staff newsletter and Schoology page to acknowledge students for following the classroom expectations in the afternoon. The ILT also explores the SEL stockpile to identify strategies grade levels departments can use to teach and reinforce self-management skills. That's what the team decided to do for this supportive environment. The fourth component is situational appropriateness. Again, take a minute to read the slide and highlight or choose a word or phrase that stands out to you and put that in the chat for us all to share. Validate and affirm. Conscious attention. Cultural differences, yes. We have to be intentional. All right, let's see what this middle school decided to do for this component. They decided that they can reflect on what work can be done and build consistency as they discuss and role play scenarios related to specific classroom managed behaviors. For example, disruption. which are being observed in high rates. Members of the team lead staff through activities targeting classroom versus office managed behaviors and clarifying the expectations and procedures for responding to disruption. The fifth and last component of culturally responsive within PBIS is data for equity. So again, same procedure. Take a moment to read the slide and highlight a word or phrase that stands out to you, and please share it in the chat. Analysis and action planning, database decision making, actively engaging in those database decisions. Perfect. Now let's see what this middle school decided to do. They want to work on including students and families in learning walks, in addition to a coordinated partnership with the school's ILT in response to the academic data. The team decides to use their WRS report to track the risk ratios for African American students at the start of each quarter. A small group of students and family members will be invited to help conduct interviews during the spring PBIS walkthroughs. With support from the school reading specialist, school improvement specialist, instructional specialist, the ILT decides to set a goal to address the achievement or opportunity gap identified in step 2. They then create an action plan for additional reading interventions and diverse grade level libraries, and the students are involved in the selection of those library books for grade levels. All right, we've reviewed those 5 components of cultural responsiveness within PBIS. And now we're going to move on to step 4. We want to evaluate the plan to see if it's working. Our final step involves collecting short-term data and progress monitoring to determine whether the strategies selected in step 3 are being implemented and are effective in solving the identified problem. We have to ask ourselves some questions. Did we do what we said we would do in our plan? This connects directly with step 3. What are our risk ratios now? This question speaks to step 1. Have we made progress toward the goal we set? This also connects with step 1. What are our risk ratios now? And have we made progress towards the goal we set? This also connects with step 1, problem identification. And then, how are we going to share the results with our relevant stakeholders, with our groups, including families and students and the community? So here's the middle school example. Their final step would be to look for the middle school team. The middle school team would look and determine whether they completed the tasks they said they had planned, adjust for any needed improvements, check their progress towards their goal, and establish a plan for continued monitoring if needed. The PBIS team reviews and examines their action plan on a monthly basis. They pay particular attention to completing implementation tasks with fidelity. After the first month, they discuss the possibility that staff may need another refresher on classroom versus office managed behaviors and the discipline flowchart and how to use it. At the end of the first year, the team notes that the risk ratio for African American students has decreased from 3.2 to 2.3. They're making some progress, but more improvement is needed to reach their goal. So at the end of the year meeting, the team discusses their meeting schedule and procedures for monitoring their progress. The team agrees that their monthly, quarterly, and yearly monitoring has worked reasonably well, but they plan to continue this evaluation in the coming year to meet their final goal. So that was a lot, I know. You have access to this resource at the end of the presentation, and I'm now going to turn it over to Elizabeth Bryant, Coordinator of Parent Stakeholder Services within the Department of School Leadership. She's going to talk about what support might look like through DOSL.
Good morning. Thank you, Denise. The Department of School Leadership is here to support your school in their goals and missions. We recognize that the return to face-to-face instruction for the 21-22 school year will bring its own challenges. PBIS is a critical strategy to support our students and help them reintegrate back into your school culture and your community. Looking at the strategic action items for this year, PBIS is a critical component in all 3 of these strategic actions: educational equity, integrated systems of support, and future-ready students. As your school develops their PCI, you will also develop your PCI goal statement with your PBIS team. With the Student Support Services and Department of School Leadership, we've created a response to discipline disproportionality, guiding questions to support school leaders. So this was developed in order to help the conversations around your discipline disproportionality amongst your school admin team and with the Department of School Leadership in your school support meetings. We want to build the capacity of your school teams in order to support our students. As mentioned earlier, the principal can access your school level data through your secure data folder. And again, the last full year of data was from the 2018-2019 school year. As your team works on your PCI, depending on your level, elementary, middle, or high, you will have a choice goal that includes SEL or future ready students. PBIS is a strategy in both of those areas. So revisit your PBIS goals and your behavior matrix, and consider how your reintegration plan and PBIS can support your processes. PBIS is not new, and it's not one more thing. As Dayla mentioned earlier, the history of PBIS in our division began several years ago. It isn't new, but it is evolving. PBIS is embedded in so many different components of your school, including the new SFAR and the Code of Student Conduct. We recognize the work that you are doing at your school, and we want to continue those conversations, and we want to support you in your work. What I want to do next, we're going to look at this question. How can we support your work? What support do school leaders and school teams need in order to effectively use this guide in response to discipline disproportionality? We're going to go into breakout rooms, and the third slide on the Jamboard that we used earlier will be the place you're going to add your feedback on this question. So Dayla, will you go ahead and organize our breakout rooms? Okay, as everyone is coming back in from their breakout rooms, if you'll go to the next slide, I'll wrap it up today. So in the chat, as we're wrapping up, if you want to share any thoughts on what really struck you today in our session, what really stood out to you, what you're ready to take back to your school right away and implement with your team or your PBIS team or your admin team, what are you going to take away? The slide deck is available for you if you want to share with your PBIS team or your full staff. And I want to thank Dayla and Denise for presenting this morning. The document that has all of the links referenced in today's session will be posted in the chat so that you can review that. There was a lot of information shared today, and I'm confident that you will return back to your schools and your PBIS teams with specific tasks in mind to address any gaps in your discipline data. We know you're doing this work, and this guide gives you systematic processes to guide your work. Dayla?
Yes, we want to thank you all for joining us today. We are grateful for your interaction today in this session and your feedback. As Elizabeth Bryant mentioned, your feedback is critical as we just collaborate together, but also as we use some of the feedback you've offered us to inform how we will support school teams and schools across the division moving forward. This is not a linear process. It's also unique to each school. And so we commit to helping you all in this process. And so feel free to reach out to any of us and any of these offices you see here for support as we move forward. And so once again, thank you so much for being with us in this session today. We hope you have a great rest of your day and a great school year as well.